Today, it's my pleasure to welcome here at the Prague Talks on Digital Humanities Roman Bleier and Florian Zeilinger, who are both historians. Roman Bleier his specialization is medieval history, and Florian Zeilinger's specialization concerns history of early modern ages, or early modern history. And they both work today, or now they both work on a project on an Imperial diet, and they are editing texts stemming from this diet, and they prepare also a digital representation of these texts. So today they are going to speak about this project and about the digital edition and the technical background of this edition. So Roman and Florian, the floor is yours.
So I start sharing. Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
It's visible. Screen mode. Here we go. So thanks, Otto, for this kind introduction, and thank you very much also, Hannah and Otto, for the invitation to present at your lecture series, Prague Talks on Digital Humanities. I'll start immediately with the first slide. Editions play a central role in historical research, as they make primary sources used by historians to study the past more accessible. Today, as facsimile images of historical material becomes increasingly published online, many may question the need to create editions. However, a critical scholarly edition is not simply a representation of a source document, but a valuable research tool in itself. The editors carefully select the source materials to be edited and provide introductions and commentaries and other paratexts to contextualize the text and its content. Scholarly digital editions. Scholarly digital editing is a subfield of digital humanities and explores the demands that digitality makes on textual criticism and editing. Patrick Sahle and others have tried to define scholarly digital editions. Sahle suggests that scholarly digital editions are scholarly editions that are guided by a digital paradigm in theory, method, and practice. An example for the digital paradigm is, for instance, XML markup that can be used to generate multiple outputs, or the use of hyperlinks to produce multiple reading paths. Another significant factor of a digital edition is that it cannot be given in print without significant loss of content or functionality. For instance, if a hyperlink is printed, it cannot be used anymore to jump to another resource. Or if the XML markup is printed, it cannot be used to generate different representations of a text. Over the last 30 years, many hundreds of scholarly digital editions have been developed, covering a wide range of different subjects and disciplines. Sahle and others have started to compile lists and collect data about digital editions. Sahle's catalog contains more than 800 entries, but it only is a fraction of the digital editions available online. Nevertheless, it holds valuable data if one attempts to get an idea of what kind of digital editions exist. A couple of years ago, I analyzed the use of persistent identifiers in digital scholarly editions in Sahle's catalog. To gain some insight into how and what kind of editions are cataloged, I created this visual representation of selected data from the catalog. There is a lot of interesting things to see here, among others the bias towards German and English editions that Sahle also mentions. But I was also surprised that nearly 50% of the digital editions cataloged by Sahle had the assigned discipline history. You can see this on the on the diagram on the top right side. The high representation of history among the disciplines may be due to the selection process of the catalog, but I also like to think that it shows that historians play an important role in the development of new methods to critically edit and represent historical sources, and what they certainly do. A couple of years ago, Georg Vogeler suggested that already in print editing, historians have developed a specific way of editing historical documents. And this is also visible in digital editing. Vogeler based his argument on the one hand on his own experience with print editions and mentioned several examples, such as the editions of the Imperial Diet records and the Diplomata series of the MGH. On the other hand, he also analyzed the editions listed in Sales' catalog under the general subject heading history, the ones that we just have seen just before. We have seen that there are quite a substantial amount of editions to analyze. A common characteristic of this kind of editions is that the general interest in the content of the edited text. Depending on the research interest, this might be different things, but frequently people, places, dates, events get special attention. In print editing, this is expressed, for instance, by elaborate indices or abstracts at the beginning of edited texts, listing relevant places, people, topics, events. The goal is to facilitate the work of historians and to make a content layer of the text better accessible for the reader. In scholarly digital editing, interface elements such as charts, timelines, maps, interactive indices, semantic markup, and dedicated databases have similar functionality to guide the user to relevant information within the edited texts. Vogeler suggested to use the term assertive editions in order to avoid the impression that this method of editing can only be used by historians, which is certainly not the case. And he emphasized the potential of ontologies and web of data technologies for this kind of editing. At the University of Graz, we realized several editions using this approach. For example, the edition of the account books of the town of Basel uses the so-called bookkeeping ontology to extract information about transactions from early modern account books. Or the project Hearth Tax Digital uses an ontology to extract taxation information from historical records. The edition of the records of the Imperial Diet of 1576 follows a similar approach, and my colleague Florian and I work on these projects for already several years, and we want, after a brief introduction to the subject and editorial history, talk about the editions and the edition and the work we are doing on this project.
Thank you, Juan. I hope I can still be heard. So, in the history of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which you can see here in the middle of this map, the Imperial Diet, or Reichstag, is considered one of the most important imperial institutions. The assemblies, which were convened by the emperor at irregular intervals and which lasted several weeks each, produced a large number of written documents which have been successfully edited by the Historical Commission at the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities since the 19th century. The editing practice of individual imperial diets has changed over the course of time, depending on the extent of the document material and the limitations of the printed book as a medium. which made a certain selection of edited texts necessary, and, in terms of content, on the political constellations and thematic focuses of the respective assemblies. Basically, however, these were always historical print editions with an interest in the text as content and its mediation. The aim of our pilot project is to document, index, and edit the surviving written records. This includes to explore the possibilities of digital editing, to build up the digital infrastructure for the further editorial work of the series, and to test new research approaches to make the dynamic deliberative process systematically describable. From the 25th of June to the 12th October 1576, Emperor Maximilian II, his councillors, and more than 200 representatives of the imperial estates deliberated and decided on the political fate of Central Europe in Regensburg, a city on the Danube. They negotiated on political issues, for example, on taxation and justice, and on foreign policy, for example, Poland and Russia. The provenance of the representatives of the individual imperial estates is shown on this map in red, that of the foreign legations in blue. The imperial estates themselves deliberated in three curiae, those of the electors, those of the princes, and those of the imperial cities, which, after their deliberations, exchanged views with the monarch several times. To the editorial history, in 1858, on the initiative of the historian Leopold von Ranke, the Bavarian king founded the Historical Commission at the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Its first task became the publication of the German Imperial Diet's records. About 160 years later, more than 90 volumes have been published, but still not all imperial diets have been edited. For example, our Imperial Diet of 1576. There are now 4 departments working in parallel. The older series for the time before Emperor Maximilian I, the middle series under Maximilian, the younger series for the Reformation era, and, important for our edition, the imperial assemblies from 1556 to 1662. The work in the latter department is especially challenging since the sources for this period are available en masse. The previously affected edition guidelines for these imperial diets were established in 1988. What was edited concerned the imperial diet in its entirety, supplemented by minutes of individual curiae on their internal deliberations and petitions of individual subjects. Nevertheless, there are several problems with these existing editions. Firstly, the hitherto dominant restriction of editorial interest to the contents of the deliberations and the curiae, their decisions and function, means that they can only be used to a limited extent for a historiography increasingly interested in communication, procedures, decision-making, and thus the functioning of this kind of political participation. Secondly, indexing by means of registers of the classical printed versions prove to be too inflexible to make the source material usable for a variety of research questions. Thirdly, for the second half of the 16th century onwards, the increasing flow of sources can no longer be presented in a manageable form in the medium of the book, despite the most extensive editorial selections and interventions. digitized editions of Reichstag's records drawn from the printed versions so far exist, implementing some search functions superior to print. Partly retro-digitized printed editions, partly digitized versions of print editions which have indexes linked to the full text, thus enabling basic full-text searches. These editions represent a big step towards assertive editions. In addition to this, our project mainly offers a more elaborate data model and the XML-TI and RDF data. Let me now show you what editions so far offered and what our edition provides. As you can see on the left, the previous editions listed the archival collections consulted, and only a few, it is a maximum of 5 of the potentially more copies of individual documents, were explicitly mentioned for each text. In the screenshot above, the 5 red underlines. Now, for the first time, a database with the archival documentation of the records is being created, which lists the corresponding central archival collections at the level of files and makes the selection of sources for the transcription more transparent. You can see the documentation of file level on the next slide. Exactly, thank you. Core sources are minutes, negotiation files, petitions, etc. It is very different types of sources. We, and this means especially Christiane Nierfeld and Lukas Lang, visited 34 archives where we found the records of around 100 participants, half of those who submitted envoys to the Imperial Diet. It was important for us to make the selection in such a way that the diversity of the empire, geographically and in terms of the estates and in terms of confessions, was represented as well as possible. In total, the archival documentation contains information on more than 10,000 files. In our project internal secondary archive in the cloud, their records are stored in approximately 77,000 JPEGs. In cooperation with the Austrian State Archives, images of some of the archival documents will also be made available on our website. The purpose of this approach is to provide an overview of the Reichstag's records, regardless of which documents we have selected for the edition. What about the edited texts and, therefore, the editorial guidelines? The handwritten sources were transcribed and thereby partially normalized. We have, for example, abbreviations, editorial punctuation, and I and J as well as you and we were transcribed according to their phonetic value, etc. So please see also the Empfehlungen für die Edition frühneuzeitlicher Texte as a decisive text for many editions and our editorial guidelines presented on the website. We added to the transcribed text a factual commentary to historic backgrounds based on current research literature, explanation for unclear formulations, and cross-references to other texts. The markup of dates, persons, and places make it possible to click on individual dates and names, for example here on the mention of the emperor, and to get a pop-up with more information and a link to the index with even more details. And there are subject terms summarizing the content at the beginning of each edited text. Of course, there is also a text critical apparatus. Except for the minutes, each text basis was checked against a collation copy B, if possible. Any deviations in content, deletions or additions have been noted. If the result of deletions and additions in B differed from that of the textual basis, the text was also compared with the collation copy C. You can see an example on this slide with the text critical apparatus on the right side. While so far the texts were partially transcribed and collated in full text and partly reproduced as a summary, the supplications of individual petitioners were only presented in file summary in the editions so far. If no minutes are available, they were constructed from fragments of minutes or other groups of sources, first and foremost, the reports and directives, which were not edited themselves. What about our edition? Yeah, thank you, Roman. Please, the next slide. Wonderful. And I hope the connection still works because we get the small tempest here. Our edition will contain far more full texts than before, and a total of around 4,000 pages of material in the form of 175 individual items. We have here examples from editions so far with abstracts at the beginning of the texts, Kopfregisten, then the text bases and collation copies plus 2 more copies are mentioned. Like I said, in our archival documentation, we have even more copies mentioned and documented. And parts of the edited texts are summarized. So on the next slide, we can see an example from minutes, again with summaries, also with shortenings, so not all is transcribed in full text, and down in the apparatus with commentary and cross-references to other minutes. So there is some compilations of minutes. Okay, please to the next slide, Roman. In order to maintain comparability with the volumes that have been published in book form, the presentation of edited texts in the form of chapters was retained. In our case, we have the documents from the letter of invitation to the proposition and on to the Imperial recess, Reichsabschied, including negotiation files on the content of the proposition, minutes documenting the formal and informal course of negotiations, supplemented by reports that shed light on events from the perspective of the delegation of an imperial estate. Minutes, as I said, are not compiled, but integrally transcribed in full text, plus day-by-day indexing in the archival documentation. And reports are transcribed for the first time. Those parts of the proceedings of the Imperial Diet that were not put on the agenda by the Emperor, but which the estates discussed together, regardless of their composition, are classified and edited as side negotiations, here the letter G. Those were, for example, those concerning the war in the Netherlands or the Polish royal election. The deliberation of the Catholics and the Protestant estates on the peace of 1555, which were of central importance for the imperial diets of the second half of the century, also fall under this category. Since the beginning, the texts have been made accessible in a differentiated manner by means of an index containing places, persons, and topics. Also, you can see here an example from edition so far and an example from our edition.
All right, so I'm back. Unfortunately, we have a tempest. I hope that you don't get disturbed by the heavy rain that is outside just of this window a meter far away from me. Okay. So, with the pilot project, der Regensburger Reichstag des Jahres 1576, the Imperial Diet of Regensburg in 1576, the Historical Commission at the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, in cooperation with the Center for Information Modeling at the University of Graz, is breaking new ground, not only by developing the first digital edition of an Imperial Diet records, but also by integrating web of data technologies into the edition in order to develop an assertive edition following the model suggested by Vogeler. The collaborative project is funded by the DFG, by the German DFG and the Austrian FAF, and led by Gabriele Haug-Moritz and Georg Vogeler. Besides Florian Zeilinger and myself, there are several other pre- and postdoctoral researchers working on the team, and they are listed here on the slide. The digital edition is being developed in the GAMS, the Digital Repository and Humanities Asset Management System of the University of Graz, which is being developed and maintained by the Center for Information Modeling. The GAMS infrastructure currently hosts about 60 digital editions and other projects, including the Basel account books and Health Tax Digital, which I mentioned before. As Florian Zeilinger already mentioned, the main parts of the edition are the archival documentation and the edited texts. Both have a very different data model. The archival documentation is primarily metadata, but documents also administrative activities and information clerks added for other clerks, for instance. It is realized as a series of TI manuscript description elements. The edited texts, on the other hand, are either transcriptions enriched with TI markup or collations using the TI critical apparatus module. The main editorial focus is on the aspect of deliberation and the interaction and communication between political actors, which is central to the Imperial Diets in general and engages with the already mentioned new interests of historiography in communication procedures and the functioning of this kind of political participation. Within the project, an ontology of pre-modern parliamentary assemblies communication, or PAPAC for short, was developed. Following Vogeler's idea of an assertive edition, the ontology is used to extract information about documented communication acts in form of semantic triples, as RDF, from the archival documentation and edited texts. The RDF is then added to a triple store database that is part of the GAMS infrastructure. The link between the database entries and the edited texts they are coming from allows it to assert the information stored in the database and link it back basically to its original source in the edited text. The conceptual model of pre-modern parliamentary assemblies communication is based on the following axiomatic statements. Communication is performed in a regular, formal, or irregular, informal mode. It is brought into existence by communication partners. There are agents participating in communications. Most of them are political agents. They can be individuals, individual persons, for instance, the emperor or individual envoys. Individual persons can be gathered into groups, for instance, the group of the Austrian envoys. Also, organizations, institutions, and corporations are recorded as groups. For instance, the Imperial Chamber Court or the Imperial cities. As well as informal social aggregations. For instance, the Protestant estates. The participants in the communication can be mandated by political agents that are not present, but that are absent and basically correspond via letters. Communication is an event that happens at the geographical place where, at the time when, and a single communication act deals with at least one specific topic. What? The topic can be political, can be a political issue, a political agent, an event, or a place. Communication can be part of other communications, and they can follow other communication acts in sequence. As communication channels, we distinguish between verbal or non-verbal, written or non-written communication. As was already mentioned, we identify communications in the archival documentations and edited texts, and this information becomes available in the TripleStore database for searches, for search queries and exploration. The PAPAC ontology attempts to describe pre-modern parliamentary deliberation in general and provides mappings to external resources, and the CDOC CRM, the central ontology in the cultural heritage sector. We believe that our conceptual model is general enough to support profitable comparisons, and therefore will enable future work into understanding how interaction and communication work not only in the German imperial diets, but in pre-modern parliamentary assemblies in general. The journey from the document to the database can be briefly summarized in the following way. First, transcriptions or collations are created from digital images, and XML markup is used to document editorial decisions. Editorial comments edited as well. The edited texts are further enriched with reference to the PAPAC ontology. These references are added using the TI attribute ANA, which is part of the TI analysis module. During ingest of the TI XML data into the GAMS, XSLT style sheets extract semantic triples from the TI documents and add them to the GAMS Placegraph triple store. Consequently, each TI document in the edition has its own RDF representation that is available for internal operations and also exposed to the user via the GAMS API. Okay. Our
data model describes communication in the context of imperial diets because we propose to understand the Reichstag on the most general level as a nexus of communication. Thus, in accordance with the concept of assertive addition and research question can be combined. The markup of the texts and especially the communications is still work in progress and therefore experimental. Nevertheless, we would like to give an example. But therefore I have to start with a short explanation of the communication form, because you already heard about the distinction between formal and informal communication, which is the category of the communication form. Since the middle of the 16th century, implicit and thus unwritten rules of the imperial diet's proceedings had increasingly developed. As in other countries, the established communication practices of the assembly and their deliberations were described in an empirically oriented treatise, which took implicit rules and made them explicit, so to say. Therefore, it created something similar to modern parliamentary rules of procedure. But unlike those, practices were described here, not rules prescribed. The author of the text recognized something that modern research calls a formal structure, as the self-description of the social system of an organization. I speak about the ausführlicher Bericht, wie es auf den Reichstagen pflegt, gehalten zu werden, of 1569 or 1577, which describes the imperial diet's proceedings in detail from the perspective of a member of the Council of Electors. Its author is unknown, but thought to originate from those associated with the Arch-Chancellery of Mainz, the Empire's Chancellery. It is from persons directly involved in the practice of the Reichstag. According to the treatise, we can identify different formal elements of interaction at the Reichstag within the edited texts. Participants had at first to engage themselves, begin the Reichstag using performative acts. They had to consult and agree upon a common position, to exchange views with the monarch, and as you see on the left side, so on. Some communications, for example, proposing and votating, which are part of consulting, are listed here in detail, with their communication partners, place and time according to the treatise. These were official, formally regular communications. Special negotiations of the Protestant states, for example, among themselves, which were not described in the treatise, could also follow the pattern of formal communications with consulting and therefore with proposing, votating, and so on. This becomes clear especially by the markup of communication forms in the texts. In addition, there were informal discussions of individual Reichstags participants ad partem. In the current pilot project, two smaller sets of records have been selected for more precise annotation of communication. First, the minutes of the special religious negotiations recorded by the representatives of the Palatinate, and second, the reports of the Saxon envoys to their master Duke August of Saxony. Our annotations in both genres focus on the course of the Protestant negotiations on religious matters, which were typical for the Diet of 1576, where, for the first time, parts of the Protestant estates linked their approval to taxes for border security and war against the Ottoman Empire to their political concerns. The selection allows the comparison of minutes and reports from two different Protestant participants in the same negotiations, written for different audiences. A brief example from the minutes of September the 8th shows that the Palatine envoys proposed and thus assumed a quasi-formal leadership role in the deliberations, similar to Mainz in the electoral council described by the treatise. Here you can see a reproduction scan of the minutes where it says, Pfalz, which means the Palatinate envoys say, was maßen Caesar sich kürzlich auf der Ständschriften resolviert, das wurden sie vernommen und bewogen haben. And then the votating follows. In this example, we can tag the communication partners, time, and form. The place remains unknown. The topic is taken up specifically in the following statements of the representatives of the Protestant estates. In XML-TI, the communication is marked up within the edited text. The content tagged with the ANA attribute and corresponding elements can in turn be translated into RDF, where the communication relevant data is contained in an explicit reduced form and from where it can be fed into the database. You can see the RDF on the next slide. Exactly. And so I may.
So thanks. To basically sum up or conclude, we talked about a specific way of editing historical documents, which Georg Vogler calls assertive editing. And we used the edition of the Imperial Diet records of 1576 as an example to show how we provide the edited texts alongside a database based on an ontology addressing a specific research question. We introduced our project and its ontology of pre-modern parliamentary assemblies communication, and an example illustrating how we apply the ontology to our sources. Our edition is already available as an alpha release. We have a lot of material on the website, but it is still under development. Consequently, what we presented today is only an interim report on the editorial work that happened so far. The project started in 2018. The first project phase ended in 2021, but the project was extended and will run until mid-2023. We will continue to develop the edition and add new resources, such as facsimile images where we got the permission from several archives that we can publish them on our website. And they are mostly from documents that were not edited. So this will be additional primary source material that becomes available. We will also explore new ways to bring our user to the relevant data that they're interested in by adding, for instance, a timeline, improving on the search functionalities, etc. Hopefully our talk today has given you a little insight into the work that we are doing and the ongoing project, and we happily answer any questions that may have arisen from the talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. If anybody has any questions they would like to ask, now is the time and the place.
All right, I guess that you didn't hear me. Do you hear me now? Okay, nice. So I was also saying big thanks for this presentation, and I have some questions, but first of all, it's our other guest who can ask you a question or make a remark or some note or discuss, I think. So we would like to ask something. So far there seems to be no one, so I'll be the first one. There are several things which struck me and which are important for, let's say, more general approach to text and to editing the text in a digital environment. And it's interesting that you mentioned several times that Georg Vogeler idea about an assertive edition. And I know that this is sort of a new concept that he came with, and I'm still wondering what exactly it's about. But maybe there are some other questions which are more pressing, and one of them is how do you do this at Graz? Because Roman, you mentioned that you've got this GAMS, which is a humanistic asset management system. I'm wondering, that's kind of a background, or how is it called? Backend of which can support further editions or further applications, or what exactly is this?
Yeah. So let's start with the last question. So the GAMS basically is the digital asset management system that we have here. It's basically a digital long-term repository, and we have it's built on a Fedora. So and it has it is used since more than a decade now here in Graz, also as a long-term repository to store different projects that are done in collaboration with the team here at the University in Graz, but also internationally. We saw the health text, for instance. This is a project done with a colleague in the UK, and we have also other projects like the Imperial diet records done with colleagues in Germany. And we have also another project about medieval cooking recipes that is done with colleagues in France. We have basically one of the very few long-term repositories, certified long-term repositories in Austria. And that's also one of the reasons why we have a demanded partner on in various FAF and DFG projects, because we can our repository is also supported by our faculty, which basically gives it institutional support, and it's not just a short-term project, but we have also a long-term perspective for it. Yeah. So the GAMS is basically the infrastructure. We build digital editions in it, and it is at the same time a digital repository to store the data. The content stored in the GAMS is, like in our case, it's primarily TI documents that we upload and images. But internally, the GAMS has the different processes and pipelines that allow to extract data from these TI documents in this case. So we can then basically generate RDF, project-specific RDF. This can be controlled using style sheets, XLT style sheets, and there's also a place graph triple store attached to the GAMS, which then the RDF is then fed into this place graph, and this place graph is used as our database for search and exploration of the data, basically. Yeah. So this is kind of like how we do it here in Graz. The other question, what was the first question again? This was basically the certificate edition. Yeah. So yeah, the certificate edition is a good question. I mean, Georg basically observed kind of what has already been done by historians in the past editing. So it's not so much something new. It's something that has already been attempted in the past, and different digital editing projects use also different strategies to do this. So not everybody is using for instance, RDF. There's also different other databases that can be used, but it is essentially a combination of a database and basically the transcriptions or edited texts. The combination of these two is quite essential. The database kind of holds the information about this specific research question that is of interest, while the transcriptions or the edited texts, they provide basically then the context or the source material to support the claims that are basically then made by this database, by the data in the database. And so a researcher can always go back from the database to the actual transcriptions.
Interesting. Well, I might have a follow-up question concerning the data model. And there is a question of link open data. You mentioned that the data model is sort of applicable also to other texts. I was just wondering to which extent it's really possible, because it seems to me that the diet documents are quite specific, and then the data model for other documents, for example, from other diets, maybe not intro diets, but from diets somewhere else in Russia or something like this, might be a bit different because the structure of the meetings were different. So did you mean that this could be used for the documents from the intro diets from other years, or do you think that it can have a broader usage?
Yes, on the one hand, we try to discuss this also with the wider community. We had a conference in April with other colleagues working on early modern, similar early modern material. And we actually wanted to make a workshop 2 years ago when the whole COVID thing started. We want to make a workshop in present in Graz, working specifically on this ontology and developing this ontology. Unfortunately, this workshop didn't happen, but we still would like to continue discussing this ontology that we have developed and explore if it is also applicable to other imperial dyads and to other assemblies that work in a similar way. So we are kind of also thinking about continuing with another project that we would like to add as a follow-up project. And in this project, we hope to use the ontology also to and explore if it's possible to apply it to other imperial diet records at least. So then we have we could create like a database of imperial diet records of several imperial diet records and use this ontology to basically search and query this database.
Exactly, that would be the first step to extend it, to use it for other imperial diets. And today, hypothetical, next step could be to use it for other state assemblies. Like you said, there of course there can be differences, but unlike the cancelled conference in 2020, there was one conference now in April in Graz this year, with also people working on other editions and doing research on other European assemblies. And there are, on the one hand, there are differences. On the other hand, of course, there are some similarities. For example, if we take only a few categories from our data model, like communication partners and so on, they can be, for example, found in many documents. Other categories can found in lesser documents. Yeah, and also there we have this difference between a very general usage of our data model, where we understand each text as one communication, and then we have our case study where we look in particular texts in a smaller text corpus, and where we mark up communications inside these texts, communications that are reported in these texts. And of course, they are much more specific.
Yeah, what also could be also considered is basically that we are talking about this kind of ontologies and linked open data kind of standards. And there's always a way, for instance, if somebody else has or there's another project introduces a similar ontology or something like this that to a certain degree overlaps with what we are doing, it's always the possibility to link only to certain parts of this ontology and to basically say, well, these are basically the same concepts that we are talking about, but these are different concepts. So that's always possible, and that's also interesting, I think, to explore when it actually comes to this point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, sorry for that, but I have another question, which is sort of stemming from what you said. If I imagine such a big project like this project on the records of the Imperial Diet of 1576, it comes to my mind that the data model could be very rich, actually richer than what you show. And I can imagine that it was vital to have a conference about what's important and what's not important and what's common in the various entries. But I'm just wondering, because in these documents there are many more or maybe there are many more metadata than is shown in the data model. So, for example, there are the names of people who were there, who participated in the talks and the exchanges. So, do you plan to include some metadata related to these people and take them, for example, from Wikidata, or because I noticed that you're using Wikidata, Grid, and GeoNames.
GeoNames, yeah, right. So we have basically specifically we use the GND, the German authority file, but we also use GeoNames for geographical names. So the GND we use specifically for people, for linking to people, because many of our people are actually referenced in the GND. And then we have also several other external authority files or reference projects that we link to. Yes, but yeah, but the data model that basically this simple model that I showed you is basically focusing specifically on communication. There are then we have then also TI data models, both for the AD and for the transcriptions and collations, which are basically documented in TI auth style, the common style to document these TI data models, and they basically focus then on the actual specifics of editing the text and the details of recording how our editorial process on a more granular level. So when it comes, what the ontology that I presented today is basically specifically based around this communication issue, or this communication research question or research interest. And that's also the kind of difference that we would like to separate here. Basically, we have on the one hand these edited texts that have their own data models and they have their own relevance as edited texts, and besides this we have this ontology that's basically put on top of it and is used to extract certain information, certain facts, if you want, from the TI and provides and generates a database for the researchers.
Okay, thank you very much. So are there some further comments, questions, notes?
I might have a more general question.
Yes,
in
please.
terms of the, coordinating and managing a project of such complexity, a digital project of such complexity for such a long time. After 4 years, what would you say are your biggest lessons learned?
Florian, would you like to start? Thanks for the question. It's a good question.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for the question. I'll try, because of course there are lessons learned, and maybe one very big lesson, but also very general lesson is that, of course, this is a pilot project, and so we had to figure out a great number of things, how to do them. Of course, there are some patterns. We can relate on editions so far, about the editorial guidelines and so on, to some extent, like I said before. But we had to try how to do the archival documentation, how to do the indexes, which are now a little bit more complex than they were before, with the linked open data and so on. And of course, yeah, there were many things we had to discover, many things we had to decide for the first time how we could do them, which of course needs time, but step by step. So we developed those rules. Yeah.
It was, I mean, kind of the negotiation on an infrastructure to basically share information, share files, basically how to meet digitally. These are kind of things that we luckily set up quite early in the project because of our dislocation, because some people are working in Graz, some people are working in Germany. So it was also really actually very good when during the COVID period, we didn't actually have a big trouble of switching to digital only, because we were anyway using SharePoint to share files. We were using Google Doc to write collaboratively on documents. We were using basically Skype at this time still, because the other platforms were not available. So, but we were basically used to work in this environment, and this was actually something that was very good, and I think is very important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another difficult part also was somehow that it was sometimes not clear what to expect. So the archival documentations basically were created by colleagues going to the archives for several weeks, and we basically had to provide them with a specific data model before, so that they could add information to this data, to basically create the entries. It was, however, not. We however needed a couple of months to basically fine tune this data model to a certain point that we could say, okay, now we are happy with it, and now it can go on. It now it basically works. So the kind of what basically Florian said about this experimental state, this is always somehow a problem, because it takes actually much more time than you think initially till the project actually runs as it should be running. Because there's things that you basically don't factor in, and they might keep delaying other things. Yeah.
But exactly. But therefore, we would hope that somebody would use this infrastructure we built up, because, of course, for the first time you have to make these decisions. You have to learn these lessons, but for the second or third time, you could use this experience, and it would be much easier. Maybe another thing, if I compare our project to other projects we heard about in the last weeks and last month, we did not do many things in a very automated way. We did some of them, thanks to Roman, but we did many things, especially the markup, or a very big part of the markup, we did by hand, due to the diversity, the variety of sources, of different source types of genres. Yeah, and I think also due to our approach, which also is which also needs time, because there are other projects with other approaches which have the possibility to do many things automated, which means a different workflow.
Yeah, I think maybe like the using transcribers or handwritten text recognition or something like this would have been really an interesting approach. The thing is, we started already with a lot of Word documents that were left over from a preceding project. So we had some of the texts already in Word format, and they were just revised. They were basically had to be revised by our editors and brought into the TI format. But for many texts that had to be basically transcribed and marked up by hand. I'm also wondering if it might have been better to explore how tools like transcribers would have done, how they would have worked with our materials. Might have been a good attempt and a case study, but yeah, we'll see. Maybe the next project.
Future challenge.
Yeah.
Yes, and I like the word fine tuning. I think it's all about fine tuning, and I wish you luck in the continuation of the project with the fine tuning.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Yes.
So, are there some further comments or questions or notes or questions concerning completely different topics from Digital Humanities? So it seems that there are no further questions.
Everybody's satisfied?
Seems so. I think that one of those ideas which I take from today's presentation is that if you are working on a type of a text, it's very good to meet with other people to decide on data model. Because there are people who think that some other type of metadata are important for their research, and they can see more than a researcher alone sees. So that's a good idea to do. Yes.
Absolutely, I agree. I mean, we actually had the great benefit that Josef Leeb, a scholar at the Historical Commission, who is doing digital edition since many years, since decades, he basically joined the project halfway through the project, and I have to say we learned a lot from him in terms of what is actually relevant for the editing of the historical diet for the diet records, and I think especially if you develop something like an ontology that should be also applicable to other projects, I think it's definitely a good idea to talk to other people, to communicate also. I mean, you're trying also to communicate on in different channels by presenting simply. Try to get the word out that you have something developed that might be useful for others, and maybe you find collaboration partners and other projects that bring new insights in what you have been doing so far. Yeah, I absolutely agree, Otto.
So many thanks for this. Last occasion to ask a question to our two guests, to Roman or Florian. So it seems that that's all for today. So thank you again, Roman and Florian, for joining us today for this interesting paper and for the insights.
Thank you.
For me, it was very useful to listen to you, and so I wish you good luck with your project and with the future projects. And I'm sure that we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks again to everybody.
Thank you very much.